Atlantis. Was it a giant continent in the middle of the Atlantic? An alien civilization? The Aztecs? The Irish? Or just a figment of Plato's imagination? These are just a few of the many explanations for Atlantis. But what's the best? We work together to create books about dinosaurs, the ancient world, and mysteries. We love this stuff.
But we don't always agree.
We are Let's start with some background. The legend of Atlantis isn't exactly a legend. It's not the sort of thing that people would swap stories about back and forth. Instead, we can trace Atlantis back to exactly one person, Plato. Writing around the year 360 BC, Plato tells the story of Atlantis in two of his works, Timaeus and Critias. In those works, he starts off with this elaborate story about how he first learned about the Atlantis legend. Apparently, the famous Athenian lawmaker Solon went to Egypt, where he heard about this from a family of secret priests, then told it to someone who told it to someone who told it to Plato, something like that. But you all know the basics of the Atlantis story. Atlantis, among other things, was a vast continent, supposedly the size of Asia Minor and Libya put together, and it sat beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The great harbor of Atlantis had merchant ships coming from all over the world, and the harbor featured a series of concentric rings with a canal where ships could go to the very center island. And at the center of the continent of Atlantis was a giant mountain. Atlantis had advanced technology that was a marvel of the ancient world. To take just one example, they had plumbing that featured hot and cold water for even common people. It was also a military power. It controlled its entire continent, as well as surrounding islands, and even some of the mainlands around the Mediterranean. At one point, the greedy Atlanteans turned their mighty navy on the Greek city of Athens. Fortunately for the Athenians, by virtue of their superior form of government, they were able to defeat the Atlanteans despite their inferior numbers. Eventually, of course, the entire island of Atlantis was destroyed. As Plato famously says, "But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea." Now, most of the philosophers and scholars who came after Plato in the ancient world assumed that Plato invented this whole Atlantis story as a vehicle for getting across his points on philosophy and the nature of proper government. For instance, that's what Aristotle thought. But this was not the only viewpoint. Some folks, like Crantor, thought that Atlantis was very much real. And Crantor was the student of somebody who was Plato's student, so you would think he has some credibility here. Crantor may have claimed either to have visited Egypt, seen the hieroglyphics, and talked to the priests who confirmed Plato's story, or at least met with travelers from Egypt who did the same thing. Now let's go to the early modern world. Around the time of the Renaissance, it was commonplace for scholars of the time to use the idea of Atlantis as a sort of a vehicle for an exploration of their idea of an ideal government. And some, such as Francis Bacon, suggested that the idea of Atlantis could maybe be found in the New World? What? And then, of course, we have the more fanciful, but more fun, interpretations that first arose in the 19th century. Perhaps the most famous of these is Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, he published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. This was a very fun idea that put Atlantis as a giant island right in the middle of the Atlantic and claimed to trace the extent of the Atlantean Empire well into the New World and across much of the Old World as well. In more recent times, everyone from serious archaeologists to maybe more fringe types have suggested all sorts of candidates for Atlantis. And that's what brings us here today. But first of all, let me get ahead of what some people may say in response to basically everything that we're saying. Let's just confront right on the scholarly consensus, which is that Plato basically invented Atlantis to serve his philosophical argument. And there is a lot going for that theory. A lot of it is what I described earlier, that a lot of his contemporaries, including Aristotle, just assumed that's what he did. And also, this was a pretty common practice of the time. Remember, I mentioned that Plato claimed to have gotten this story kind of second, third hand from the famous lawgiver Solon, who in turn got it from Egypt. Now, that is actually a pretty common convention for the time. Basically, if you were Greek or if you were Roman and you wanted your story to sound ancient and cool, you attributed it to the Egyptians. And that sort of gave your story a lot of cool credibility. This could very well be what Plato is doing there. But there is between, saying that X place is Atlantis, 1-to-1 ratio, and the other extreme of saying Plato totally made it up. There's a sort of in-between area, and that's what I want to focus on. And that's that Plato may be drawing on some sort of vague cultural memory of an earlier civilization. So I'm not saying that this civilization was Atlantis, but I am saying that through the centuries, through the millennia, being passed down, there is some sort of echo there. There's some kernel of a source that Plato may have been relying upon. And that is why I am pointing to the Minoan civilization. I love the Minoan civilization, and Brian knows this firsthand. Me and Brian, I've mentioned this before, we're working together on a book project. It's called Red Rex, going to be published November of 2024 with Bandersnatch Books. Look out for it. But part of it is I want a lot of ancient illustrations. And whenever Brian gives me an illustration, I almost always give him the note, more Minoan.
I confirm.
But the Minoans are a fascinating group. Their civilization flourished on the island of modern-day Crete, starting around 5,000 years ago. In some ways, they were the first European civilization. And I say in some ways because it's not clear that we should really think of them as European. Culturally, they had a lot more in common with Near Eastern peoples like Iran. But we do know that the Minoans were really gifted sailors. They had a maritime and merchant empires going all throughout the Mediterranean, and we found Minoan artifacts all throughout the Mediterranean ports. It's also important to know that we call them Minoan, but that's really mostly made up on our part. We call them Minoan because of the famous mythological king Minos, who lived on the island of Crete, and he's famous for, among other things, the Minotaur. So we have the Minoans. They have this flourishing maritime trade empire, possibly a military empire around this time. Now let's go to the Minoan harbor. There's a couple ways to look at this. The main Minoan civilization was on the island of Crete, but they did have another harbor on the modern-day island of Santorini. I want you to really take a good look at the island of Santorini. It's an island pretty close to the island of Crete, obviously in the Mediterranean. I want you to go back to the way that Plato described the port for Atlantis. He talked about rings of concentric circles dividing land, sea, until we get to a central place. Looking at a satellite image of Santorini today, you can see how that could be. And for reasons that I will get to in a bit, Santorini originally had further layers of rock that would have been dividing up the rings of ocean that later crumbled away. So we can see how very easily the island of Santorini could get developed into this concept of a port, just like Plato mentioned. Also, Plato mentions that the island of Atlantis has a mountain at the center, which is about 50 stadia from the center. Now, we need to be careful using ancient measurements like the stadia. But if we use what we sort of think it was, we can imply from that the whole island was about 11 miles square. Interestingly, the modern-day island of Santorini is about 10 miles square. So we're already looking at an area that's about the same size if you measure things correctly. Also, the Minoan civilization had a lot of really impressive building works. Some of the palaces decorated with a lot of intricate frescoes. They were really master builders. And the natural rocks in the area lent themselves to building in rocks that were white, red, and black. Those happen to be a lot of the colors that were mentioned by Plato. Plato also mentions the advanced technology of Atlantis. One of the aspects of this was the ability to have hot and cold water running freely, sort of indoor plumbing that was available even to common people. Well, the archaeological sites in the Minoan civilizations indicate they had this very thing. There's also the fact that the bull seemed to play a very important part in both Atlantis and the Minoans. Plato mentions that the bull plays a prominent ritual role for Atlantis, whereas the artwork and some of the things that we have preserved from the Minoan civilization indicate that bulls played a very prominent role in their probably religious rituals. Let's sort of take a pause here what we have right now. We have an advanced civilization that had a huge maritime empire stretching throughout the Mediterranean. It also had lots of specific modern conveniences that were mentioned by Plato and had a harbor that probably looked a lot like the one that Plato described in Atlantis. And if you calculate everything correctly, may have been approximately the size laid out by Plato. Do you have any questions right now, or have I just won the argument?
You haven't won yet, but I don't have any questions as of right now.
Okay, how about you, Drew?
So you said that the Minoans also had the ability to turn hot and cold water on?
Yeah, they basically had a system of indoor plumbing, and when you combine that with, I believe, natural springs, they're able to get hot and cold water inside.
But was it like at will? Like if you wanted hot water, you could have hot water, and then if you wanted cold water, you could have cold water, or they just had access to.
I do not know that part. I would have to take more in. But suffice to say, for our purposes, they had very advanced plumbing.
Okay.
So how far back did you say the Minoans go? Like how far back does this predate Plato?
So they were already going by about, I want to say 4000 BC. The civilization endured until about 1400 BC. So Plato's writing about 300 BC. The Minoan civilization, as we would know it from the archaeological record, had been gone for about 1,000 years by the time Plato was writing.
Thank you.
So let me pause now and address what I think is a very fair criticism of a lot of these Atlantis theories. And that's that if you pick and choose what aspects of Plato's account you go through, you can make a whole lot of civilizations plausible Atlantis candidates. I know the first time I saw this Santorini theory, I was totally convinced. I was like, all right, there we go. Minoans equals Atlantis. There we go. But then I saw another episode of like some Discovery Channel episode talking about this city in like modern day Greece and another one in Spain. And I also found them about equally convincing. And I was like, oh, they can't all be Atlantis. So maybe it's just actually pretty easy to build a case if that's what we're doing. As compelling as I do find that, I do think Santorini has an ace up its sleeve that a lot of these other civilizations does not. And that is the volcanic eruption. The island of Santorini is very, very close to an active volcano. We know from other evidence that this volcano has erupted periodically every, lots of thousands of years. And we also know from various sources of evidence that this volcano erupted sometime around 1600 to 1500 BC. This eruption would have been absolutely cataclysmic. By some estimates, this might have been the largest eruption in all of known human history. And there's even some evidence suggesting that this eruption was visible from China. This is a massive, massive event. This would have completely obliterated any civilization on the island of Santorini. It would have caused a lot of the harbor to collapse into the ocean. Now, we think that the mainland of Crete would have mostly escaped the effects of this eruption. However, this eruption also likely would have caused catastrophic tsunamis. So the ocean literally coming in to destroy a lot of the civilization on Crete. And there's evidence that we found in the archaeological record suggesting that that is what happened, that at some point around this time frame that Crete was hit by a tsunami. And after this happened, as you can imagine, this crippled the Minoan civilization. The survivors of it, mostly on Crete, would have had a lot of their farmland destroyed, a lot of their buildings destroyed, and that would have made them a lot more vulnerable to outside forces like the Greeks. Let's go back to the account of Plato, that the Atlanteans were very warlike and they went to battle with the Greeks, but eventually the Greeks prevailed. And that's what we see happening as of about 1450 onward. The Greeks seem to conquer this weakened Minoan civilization, and from after that, Crete essentially becomes Greek. Also, one very obvious criticism of this theory is that the geography doesn't match up. Remember earlier that Plato described Atlantis as being beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Now, historically, people have understood the Pillars of Hercules to mean the Strait of Gibraltar, which would mean that Atlantis has to be beyond the Mediterranean Sea, probably somewhere in the Atlantic. However, there's been more recent suggestions that the Pillars of Hercules could actually be formations jutting out from the mainland of Greece. In that case, the Minoan civilization on Crete could actually work quite well. And
But was their king's name Atlas?
Their king was named Minos.
So, I don't know.
And let me also say, again, I just want to be clear because I need to be the responsible nerd here. I do not believe that Minoan civilization equals Atlantis by a one-to-one comparison. My argument is a lot fuzzier than that. I think that if a powerful civilization like the Minoan civilization was wiped out due to this catastrophe, this volcano eruption followed by a tsunami, that's going to live in the corporate memory of a lot of the folks in the Mediterranean region. Folks like in Egypt, like in Greece. And even if there aren't a lot of specific records about it, it's going to live on in the memory, in the folk traditions, in the legends that get passed on. Maybe some of these legends, along with some of the specifics of the Minoan civilization, embellished over time, got passed down to Plato, and he sort of drew upon this vague tradition and added a lot of rhetorical and fictional flourishes for his Atlantis. That's what I think is plausible. You can never prove or disprove it, which is one of the reasons it's such a fun theory, and I like it. But I think that argument is completely plausible. And me personally, because I just like the Minoans and I think they're cool, I like to believe that they're the inspiration for Atlantis.
So you're saying that they're the inspiration for the story, essentially, not that they are Atlantis.
Yes, I am saying that that a folk memory of the Minoan civilization and their destruction was sort of the kernel that Plato used for inventing Atlantis.
Cool. One question with this. In your mind, why wouldn't the name Minoans have been passed down? Why is it called Atlantis?
Well, the name Atlantis does come from Atlas, like you said, Brian. So I believe Plato mentions this, where he believes that Atlas, in sort of the mythological past that he paints, that Atlas has a special rulership role over Atlantis. That is a part of it that we don't exactly know what the Minoans called themselves, and we don't know what other people called the Minoans exactly. We have some ideas about what the Egyptians may have called them. We don't know what the Minoans called themselves. So I don't know where Plato would have associated Atlas with it. I can't say that. And there you have it. 3 of our favorite suggestions for what Atlantis may have been, what may have inspired Plato. If you have maybe your own favorite candidate, either one that you actually think is plausible or one that you just think is fun, please let us know in the comments. Or if any of us missed anything, if you think one of us left a good argument for our side on the table, or if we got something wrong, let us know in the comments as well. If you want to watch a similar video that we've done, one about arguing over ancient civilizations and cool giant superstructures, why not check out our video on the supposed Bosnian super pyramid?
Also, carrying over the tradition from our last video about Nessie, let's make this another competition. You guys can tell us in the comments whose theory you think is best, and maybe we can tally up the points.
And as always, don't forget to boop that like button and subscribe.